Well, we're just a couple of bridges away from Foxton Locks on the Market Harborough arm of the Grand Union Canal. In fact, not very far from my own house, perhaps about 45 minutes. This is the venue I've chosen to show you bread fishing. But let's, first of all, just have a look at the canal. Now, this canal is absolutely stuffed with little tiny roach. It's heaving with them. And there are other species, of course, but skimmer bream, in fact, there's some big bream as well. Not to mention the odd tench, the odd cruciate carp. But this bread method is really designated into catching small fish. One of the beauties about it is it will catch fish under the most hardest and extreme conditions. And whilst it's still autumn, later on in the year when the frost started coming, all the trees are bare of the leaves, and you get onto the canal one morning and it's absolutely, the fields are white over. Even the bloodworm, right, sometimes struggles for bites. And when you do catch them, it's little perch, little tommy rough, the odd little gudgeon. But bread seems to wangle out those silver fish, albeit small, but at least you're catching roach, and your weight is expected to be sometimes bigger than the actual bloodworm. Bread fishing, though, one of the tips that my father handed down, after all, it was my father who taught me my fishing, and this was the first method I was taught on the little local canal near where I live, the Peak Forest Canal. I used to spend days there. In fact, every night from school I used to be up there practicing with this bread method, and I used to catch as many as 100 gudgeon per evening. But one of the things in the early days that he taught me was cleanliness, especially when bread fishing. He used to believe that, you know, the human hands were quite absorbent, and one of his tips were, he said, to take actually a few of these ivy leaves and crunch those up between your fingers, and that, he used to reckon, used to eliminate any human smell that may be on your fingers. And it's something that when I bread fish, I always do. I can remember it vaguely as we walked along the canal, you always picked a couple of ivy leaves off a local wall sort of thing, and here you are, son, sort of crunch those between your fingers. Anyway, let's get onto the canal, pick our peg and do some fishing. You know, just looking at the canal here brings me back to my childhood days. In fact, it was right over from school. Most of the kids would be playing in the street, and I used to take my fishing tackle up to the local canal. I used to sit down there, I used to count the fish, usually gudgeon, the odd little roach, and sometimes you used to get a great big roach. I know I used to be the envy of some of the adults because I had it really sorted, this bread fishing. It was the accurate feeding and the correct presentation of the bait. And I used to catch as many as 100 fish every evening, and I couldn't get home from school quick enough to jump on that bus, just a twopenny bus ride up to the local canal and enjoy myself to my heart's content. And looking at this canal, it just brings me back to those childhood days. I love these little rushes. They always seem to hold fish, but unfortunately there's no gap in them to get... Oh, we've got a gap here. In actual fact, this is a perfect peg. We've got this little bit of cover on the inside that'll hold a few fish, and gradually we can work out, and what have we got but more cover on the far bank. This peg will do nicely. The depth on most canals is rather constant. Your deeper water is usually on this side, on the towpath side. And when you think about it, to the history of canals, it's quite obvious why. I mean, the canals were made for transporting coal, etc., right in the long barges, and it was the horse-drawn long barges that used to walk this towpath, and therefore the barges which used to be on this side of the canal actually gouged the canal out to give you that extra depth on this towpath side. Whereas across on the far side, the actual years of erosion, and the canal's gone a little bit wider and wider and shallower across there. But on match days, when the towpath is walked along heavily by anglers plodding to their pegs, then it's usually the small fish which are left in this boat channel or this side of the boat channel. And your bigger fish, the shyer fish, then they often take refuge in the shallow water under the far bank, especially if you've got an overhanging tree like we've got here. And Should those fish die off, which they generally do, you maybe get an hour or an hour and a half at them before they start to move out towards the middle of the canal, and finally they'll end up under that far bank. And if we do have to go across there, it's the quality fish, or better quality fish, that we'd expect to catch. The tattle I use, and is still used by a lot of anglers still today, fishing this method on the canals, is this, sort of a 12-foot soft action rod, a centre pin reel. And the reason why we use a centre pin is that we're continually searching, and by pulling line off with a handful of line from between the two eyes and then casting, it gave you a certain distance. The setup was ever so simple. Fine line, sort of £1.5, £1.75 main line. The float was a little bit of a secret in those days. They used to call it a crow quill, but in actual fact what we used to use was a jackdaw quill, just a little bit small, a little bit more delicate. A sort of 2 number 4s shot, which it was locked in place with, and you see it's the thin end of the quill where it's fastened on the line. The part of the quill that was actually stuck in the bird, that is painted just with a little white tip, and that was all that was remaining. And the beauty of this, in actual fact what it is, it's a mini waggler. Your line is sunk from the base of the float, and therefore under the water it's skipping any of the disturbance or any of the surface flow of the canal, and your float stands there static. In fact, you can see there a little back shot just about 12 inches or sometimes 18 inches, depending on how severe the wind was, above the float to help to sink that line. Once again, give you that stability. Shotting pattern down the line was either strung out small shots, or in the case of a very small float like this, with the hook just in my finger here, a tiny number 10, about 10 inches from the hook, and about 12 inches above that was a number 8. That's what this particular float takes to dot it right down to the tip. And it is important that you do have only the tip of the float showing, because fish, when they're feeding on bread, sometimes just suck that bait in, especially in the winter time. They just sort of suck it in, and I can remember on some very, very hard winter's days when there's not been a ripple on the water and only the little tiny millimetre of a float showing. It's not gone under even, there's just been a little ripple come from the float. And you've picked the rod up and there's been a fish on. So it is important to sink that float down so the minimum is showing. But these days, then, with all the modern technique we've got around us, then whilst a lot of people still prefer to fish this method, I, like a lot of others, prefer to fish the pole. Because the quality of poles now and the tip action of poles is absolutely brilliant. But what I'm going to start with is this little 3-metre snatcher, and simply by removing the elastic band off the winder, just let the winder just dangle there and telescope the pole out. And the line just dangles off that winder, just leaving the hook fastener, which I can just disconnect ever so easily. And you can see the length of line, total length of line, it finishes about a foot from the end of the pole. It means as I lift a fish out, the tip of the pole will bend and the fish will swing right into my tummy. It's so simple fishing. The float I've used, or the float I've chosen, is this little beauty here. Just put this pole down. It's only a 4 number 12s float, quite a slim balsa body. You can notice quite a long wire stabiliser. And because I'm only fishing quite close in, then I can usually get away without a back shot, because if the conditions will allow me, I prefer to hold the line right to the tip of the float, or right to the bristle. And I'll shot this float down so that only the bristle, or even half the bristle, is showing, because some of the bites on the bread can be so delicate, and it is important that we do shot the float down as little as possible. The actual shotting pattern itself, I've used a style rig here. Because this float is 4 number 12s, let me go to the hook end first. The hook again is one of these bloodworm hooks, the Mustard 934, this round bend hook. And just about 3 inches from the hook, you see it on my thumb there, 4 inches perhaps, is a number 9 style, quite a small style. And then Just about 5 inches above that is a number 10 style, and about 5 inches above that a number 11 style, 5 inches again to a 12 style, and about 6 or 7 inches to the final number 12 style. So it's a strung out rig that will fall through the water quite nicely, right, as that bait is cast in. And talking about the casting in of this tattle, a lot of people make the mistake of giving an underhand sort of swing. That's all right. That underhand swing is all right when you're perhaps fishing with a small olivette and then a dropper shot, when you've got all the weight based in this bottom quarters, because it's the actual olivette that you're swinging out. When you're fishing a spaced out rig, then to avoid tangles, it's most important that you go over your head and just lay the tattle on the water. In actual fact, the harder you cast it, the straighter that tattle will lie. I can actually lean forward and hold that line right behind that float. Provided I keep dropping the ground bait, little and often, that's every cast, just a thumbnail size piece of ground bait, every cast on that spot, then those fish will finally line up where that ground bait has drifted down and finally laid on the bottom. The ground bait I've got here is 2 sorts. Both of it is pure bread, which I've made myself. This is just simply fresh bread, which has been liquidized, and I just use that, mix that in with the other ground bait I've got, if I know the venue well enough that there's going to be some quality fish there. Because these are quite big particles, even though it's been liquidized, it can be quite filling for the tiny fish, which I expect to catch here in this canal. But then again, if this canal was full of some bigger bream, or if this area was full of bigger bream or tench or even bigger roach, so the 6-8 ounce fish, then this would be the sort of ground bait that I would go for, mixed in with the ground bait I'm going to use, which is this one. And all this is bread, a white loaf which has been allowed to go stale, cut into thick slices, put in the oven on a very, very low light. The quality of a good bread, pure bread ground bait is in the drying. And the slower it is dried, the better the quality is. What I mean by that is, if you dry it too quickly, when you re-wet it again, it just goes into dough. But by drying it very, very slowly, and then re-wetting it now at the bankside, you'll find that it makes a beautiful cloud of tiny, mini pieces. Hardly food, just an attractive cloud. And that is one of the secrets of bread fishing. The real, good quality, proper bread ground bait. Now there's 2 ways of mixing it. One by just adding a little water and whizzing all that together and forming a fairly dry mix. In fact, that's just a little bit too dry. You just do with adding just a little bit more water. Mind you, it's not far off. No, it's coming round now. That sort of dry mix. Now that is brilliant. I mean, that breaks beautifully. I mean, when you throw a little tiny bit in. In fact, I'll just throw a sample piece in the margins here. What a nice cloud that breaks into. And now I actually oversaturate the ground bait by, first of all, just adding a little water, mixing it evenly and thoroughly as I can to get that an even mix. And then when I've done that, when I've got it all to a really damp state, then by actually oversaturating it, let's just do it so you can see what's going on, really flood it like that. Just lift your fingers away to let the water get at the dry bit underneath, and just let it soak in right from the top. Just let it get down. It'll even stand a bit more water than that. Put the water just over the top, just flood the top like that, and let that soak in. Within a few minutes, that water will have disappeared, and you're left with a very, very saturated ground bait. But as it does, as that water does sink in there, what you're left with is that sort of consistency there. And all you do is just with your finger, just scrape a little globule like that. Just hold that into a ball, and you'll find if I do the same thing again, throw it in the margins, that creates the same sort of cloud. But this time, because it's heavier, because it's containing far more water, then you can place those little balls of ground bait accurately on the chosen shadow. You use some sort of reflection as a marker. Once you've plumbed the depth, remember the marks where you've plumbed the depth and hit that same mark consistently. And of course, that is the recipe to getting those fish together in a tight shoal and the recipe for success. Now I could kick off with the paste, just flour and water paste, and I've made one yellow and one white, and just a little tiny ball of that, ever such a tiny ball, but that's a big piece, yeah? You'll find that catches fish. And the reason why I have the yellow, I've noticed that whilst you're catching fish on the white paste, tiny fish, all of a sudden when they're coming really thick and fast, and you know there's a lot of fish there, by changing to the yellow, putting a little tiny bit of yellow paste, then that often pulls out a bigger fish. And by bigger fish, I mean maybe 2-3 ounce. The other bait I've got is my old-time favourite, and that's why I've gone to the trouble to make this little box. As you'll see, a little bit of Velcro fastened to the box. It's got a little bit of damp cotton to protect that bread, and that is bread cubes. And I find that to be a better bait often than the punch, because it's faster. It's faster to, that Velcro just goes around your leg like that, and your bait is there, ready and handy. And when your fingers get wet through catching fish, your finger ends like that, you find all you have to do is just like that. You've got a multitude of cubes on your finger, and just pick any one and stick the hook right through that cube, and everything's there to hand. It's quick. With the punch, I can use the same box, because it's a wooden box, and with the punch, you need a hard surface to be able to punch the bread. So provided you cut your bread into small pieces like that, later in the bottom of that box, you can use the punch using this same principle as well. And I find to have it there nice and handy does help and stops you keep bending and looking for your bait. So just one thing before we start, don't stand up with it strapped to your leg. The first thing I've got to do is to plumb the depth and get that magical depth just an inch off the bottom. I'm just going to use just simply a swan shot and pinch that on the bend of the hook, and I'm going to use that as the plummet right in the edge here. And of course that plummet will take that float under, but it isn't. The float's staying up there, so it's not that deep there. If I go out just that little bit farther, stretch my arm just a little bit longer, and there, see the tip of the float, it must be 4 inches under the water. So I'm on quite a steep shelf there. If I stretch my arm, I shall be 4 inches off the bottom, but I'm going to feed just a little bit short of that, and then I'm going to edge that bait back from being off the bottom, just back onto and touching the shell. And just before it touches that shell is where I expect to get the bites. So first of all, I'm going to just put one little tiny thumbnail full of ground bait in, just hook it out with one finger, that little tiny nugget, just place it very, very accurately right on the spot, just in between where the float went under and where it rested on the bottom, where the actual swan shot rested on the bottom, and we just keep feeding that in-between area. Never feed too far out, always keep the feed a little bit closer, because you can always pull your float back into the feed. Now to hook on this pressed bread, simply just press it like that. You end up with a few cubes on the end of your finger. Just stick the point of the hook into the cube, and you'll actually feel, sometimes you'll feel the point of the hook just touch your finger. In fact, at the end of a day, it's quite the end of your finger feels quite rough. It doesn't do you any harm, but where the pointed hook has continually just been touching the skin, it actually roughens the end of your finger. That overhead cast right onto that, just a little bit farther out on that ground bait, and then just straighten the line and put the float, the line at the back of the float, because whilst it doesn't look very, very windy, it's a very, very bad skim. In fact, this top and bottom rig that I've got on, I put it on because this canal does tend to flow pretty strong at times, and you can't hold it back. That was a bite with the very first cast, see, which is often the case with this method. But I was saying that this top and bottom rig, it's a brilliant rig when there is a little bit of a flow on the canal and no wind, when you want to hold the float back against the flow. But when you've got this awkward skimming wind, which has sort of appeared, then sometimes a little waggler rig, that's the float just fastened at the bottom end only, seems to work best. But I'm just going to persevere with this again. Every cast, that same little nugget of feed, right onto that same spot, flick it over the top, see that line at the back of that float. That's why I'm having to stretch forward just to make this pole as long as it possibly can be, try and keep that line at the back. My word, it's flowing through like a river now. There, I just lift like that and the fish swings right to your hand. Well, there's the first sample, little tiny roach. But then again, it's a silver fish, and that's what it's all about. If you can get those coming every cast, you're not going to break no records with weight, but at least it can be quite enjoyable. Same again, that little nugget of feed, right on the spot. Quite a current, quite a flow on this canal. What's happening, the float's actually running along. Where I'm throwing the ground bait in, the ground bait isn't hitting the bottom until it's run sort of about 2 or 3 foot. And as the ground bait hits the bottom, and as the hook gets over that area, that's where the bite seemed to appear. There it goes, that's it. Another little tiny, tiny roach. What are they, ½ ounce apiece, but who knows, those bigger ones may just appear. Often starts off with these very tiny ones, but hopefully it's the ounce and 2 ounce and even 3 ounce fish that are the ones when you start to build a weight up. And of course on some canals, by using bigger pieces of bread, or if you're using the punch, maybe even a 1/4 inch punch, which is quite a big piece of bread, and by using that liquidized bread that I showed you before, mixed in with that very fine ground bait, with an Olivette rig on, and often down the middle of the canal in the boat run there, and instead of fishing just off the bottom, with that bigger piece of bread, actually laying it on the bottom, laying it on the deck, and that does result in catching your 6, 8, 10 ounce fish. But it doesn't happen on every water. There's got to be a fair head of that sort of fish, that size of fish, for that to work. But these little canals up north and in the Midlands, absolutely inundated with these tiny roach like this. I don't think they actually saw that then, but the water just erupted with tiny, tiny fry. And again, right around the float, right in amongst all that feed, the water just erupted with tiny fry. You can imagine what has happened is there's some very tiny roach there, smaller than the ones I've just caught. And of course that's attracted the old perch. And I missed a bite then. But I'm going to go right back in, right over the top of that same last ball of ground bait. Bread's a funny bait, it's a peculiar bait is bread. You know, you think of perch as being a fish that takes a maggot or a worm, I've had no end of them on bread. Yeah, what is it? Oh, it's a roach. That's a little bit better stamp. That's the sort of fish that we'd like to catch continually. Oh, look at this. Hey, from rags to riches, or from riches to rags. Look, just shows you the size of fish that you can catch. In fact, I'm not even going to put that one in the net. Put that one straight back. That looks like this year's fry. That ever important ball of ground bait. And you know, once the fish are here, then it's relatively easy. Once everything's set up right, the depth is right, the constant feeding, then really catching them is absolutely simple. You know, these fish are coming now one behind the other. In fact, once the tattle's right, once the depth is right and everything, you get that feeding pattern of that little ball, every cast right on that spot, then of course it becomes easy. Your catch rate starts to come faster and faster, and it becomes just monotonous almost. Your catching rate becomes monotonous. But the secret is the preparation. The preparation of all these baits, both hook baits and ground baits. And once again, words of my father to me as a kid. He used to say, you know, Ian, matches aren't always won on the canal bank. He said they won in your own back garden. What he meant was the kitchen. And I think that's where we should go now. And I'll show you how all these baits have been made and prepared. Well, these are the baits that we're likely to use in this programme. Simply white and yellow paste, the punch bread, and bread cubes. And that is my favourite method. To actually prepare these baits, it's really quite simple. Let's take the paste first of all. All you need is a little tiny ball like that to last you for a good 5-hour session. And all you need is a teaspoonful of flour, which generally takes about 2 to 3 teaspoonfuls of water. Mix it together and then knead it in the palm of your hand. If it's a little bit on the sticky side, then simply just drop that ball of paste into the dry flour and knead it again until you get it to the right consistency where you can just break a little tiny bit of hook bait off, and that's it. The yellow paste is exactly the same, but all we've done this time is added a little bit of food colouring to it to get that beautiful yellow colour. And for some strange reason, it's that yellow paste that sorts out the occasional better stamped fish. The most common method that people use when they bread fish is this, the bread punch. And you can see this punch here with its various size heads, depending on the stamp of fish that you are encountering at the time. To prepare this bait, simply get a piece of fresh bread, trim off the crust around the outside, steam it over the kettle, and then with a rolling pin just flatten it, and it's instantly ready for use. And you can see it cuts a piece of bread out nice and clean. In the side of the punch there's a slit, and you simply by sliding the hook along that slit, the point of the hook centres in that little pellet of bread each and every time. In fact, that bait is untouched by human hand. But my favourite is this, the cubes. And this does need a little bit extra preparation. Get some cotton material, dampen it, and cut a slice of bread off the crust of a loaf to throw away. The first slice is you throw it away, but what you leave is a little bit of the crust on the remainder of the loaf, and it's the next slice that you're going to use, because this little brown piece here, it almost shines, it almost glistens, and for some reason or other the hook really does hold into it. It stays on the hook extremely well. Cut that slice about 3/16 of an inch thick, lie it in that dampened cotton cloth, fold it over nice and flat, press that overnight between 2 pieces of wood and maybe 3 or 4 house bricks. In the morning, peel it off, cut it into 1/8 strips, which it cuts ever so easy. I've cut this one here now just a little bit on the thick side just to show you. And then cut those 1/8 strips into cubes, into your tray. And don't cut them all square. The occasional one, just cut it triangular, because sometimes the way those triangular pieces flutter through the water, sometimes they attract a fish that you wouldn't have normally caught just cutting cubes. Well, that's the bait. I think we should get on with some fishing. Well, while you've been in my kitchen, the fish did dry up on that short line method, the little float I was fishing top and bottom with. The wind was making it a little awkward anyway, but they stayed with me for about an hour and a half. We got a few fish in the net, and you can see now that I've had to go to a longer pole because the fish have moved out towards the middle of the canal into the deeper water. But the fortunate thing is that the wind has dropped now, and it's making this top and bottom rig most effective. And that's something that we must learn, that when the conditions are ideal like they are at this very minute, there isn't a whisper of wind at all, then the top and bottom rig is without doubt the winner. That is, with the line fastened to the top of the float and the bottom of the float. But when the wind does get a little bit adverse and it starts to blow around this line between the top of the float and the top of the pole, we can put a little back shot on and sink that line, and we can get away with that. But when the wind gets stronger, then the little waggler, in other words, a float that's fastened at the bottom end only, is without doubt the best choice. And that, it doesn't matter how far out or how close in you're fishing, that same rule applies. The canal's gone dead still again now. Can expect those fish right below that cloud. You see there's no wind at all. I can keep that pole tip quite high and all that line almost to the float. I think one of the things that impressed me most as a kid was perhaps whilst your father is the chap that teaches you all the tricks, you tend to take more notice of others sometimes. And I can remember his fishing partner, Alf Shaw, he liked to show off a little bit. And I can remember one very, very cold winter's morning going to the Peak Forest Canal at Marple in Cheshire. And there was two of the Abbey A cracks, that was a Manchester club, two of the Abbey A cracks fishing the canal. And they'd won all sorts of championships and trophies and you name it. They were names to be feared, if you like, on the open match circuit. And I remember Alf Shaw, as we walked along the towpath, he said to him, "How's it going, Bill?" He said, "Oh," he said, "I've had one." He said, "And Sid's not had a bite yet." He said, "It's very, very hard this morning." He said, "But what can you expect?" He says, "What can you expect with such a severe frost?" So Alf says, "You're not doing it right." And of course Alf, he knew that they were fishing with maggot, or pinkies, or feeders, or whatever. Feeders, I think they used to fish. And Alf says, "I'll show you how to catch them." And we had to stand by, because it was embarrassing for my father, but he had to stand by and just watch while Alf got his tattle out. And sat by the side of them, 12 casts, little ball of ground bait, 12 balls of ground bait or a little ball of ground bait with each and every cast, and 12 fish in 12 casts. He says, "You're not doing it right, you're not trying." Packed his gear up and walked off to where we were fishing. And that's the sort of character he was. But I remember, that went home to me. I can remember thinking, well, that's, just shows you the strength of this bread. Two crack anglers there, failing to catch on this cold winter's morning. And yet Alf Shaw just sat down and in 12 casts had 12 fish, packed his gear together and give him a lesson. That went home to me just how important the art of this bread fishing is, or what a deadly bait it is in those sort of conditions. There you go. That's what you call catching them upside down, eh? How about that? That's a perch on. Look where it's hooked. Heaps is sat on a shed full again. You know, who said you can't catch perch on bread? In actual fact, perch do take bread. Make no mistake about it. We'll have a look at the terminal tattle now, and we'll start at the hook end. I'll just put that pole down there. Now, the hook I'm using is really a bloodworm hook. It's this Mustad 314, and you can see it there against that green packet. It's a lovely fine wire, long shank, round bend, and a very, very sharp point. I prefer a long shank hook for the same reason when you're bloodworm fishing. You can get hold of the hook easily, you can put the bait on, and it's much easier for unhooking the fish. And just above the hook, and that hook is tied to 12-ounce line. We're only looking for small fish, therefore the finer the line, the more delicate the presentation, the more bites we expect. And the first shot, in actual fact a style I'm using on this rig, is a number 8 style, just about 4 inches from the hook. And about 4.5 inches above that is a number 9 style, about 5 inches above that a number 10 style, and then 11 style, 12, 12, 12, 12, 12 plus a little bit, and 12 plus a little bit. Those little bits were just the last little bits that I needed just to shut that float down so that only half the bristle was showing. So I just put those in that region there just to trim that float off. Simply a shirt button style. You can do exactly the same with shot, but I like styles because they seem to fall through the water just that little bit more gently and sometimes attract bites on the drop. I've plumbed the depth in exactly the same way, and at the minute I'm starting with the rig just about 2 inches off the bottom. Once again, I've picked a new shadow this time, just that bit farther out, because the fish have, without doubt, moved out off that first shelf and are now in the deeper water, right on the edge of the boat run. Remember the story of the Goit Mill where I used to fish as a kid? I used to use the reflection of one of the windows opposite the Goit Mill. It was a favourite winter haunt of mine because a little bit of warm water used to come out of the mill, and I used to find the reflections of the windows very handy as markers. Every ball of ground bait used to land right in this little tiny reflection of a window. That one wriggled a little bit, but quite often they come out without even a wriggle. They just come out like little ghosts, and there's no disturbance to your swim at all. Here's a fish. Nice one. You see the canal starting to run again now. They must have opened the lock gates. Must be another boat due, and it's starting to run. And quite often that does perk the fish up. Makes them turn, stand on their head and start looking for food once that water starts to run. You know, and that's another reason why I say this canal fishing is really a basic learning to all sorts of fishing. You see we're fishing this top and bottom float. And then really it's just like stick float fishing on a river now, because really it's starting to rip through. But the reason why we've got it top and bottom, not only is it more direct with the strike, but when it does start to run like this, I can actually hold that float back and send it through at a slower speed than what the canal's, oh, missed it, than what the canal's actually moving at. And really that's what stick float fishing is about on the river. So learn it on the canals, learn the principle here first, and then go and experiment on the bigger rivers. Once you understand just how far your feed travels, where your hot spot ends up because of the flow, because of the current. And it's a great learning, canal fishing is a great learning to every aspect of fishing. This one's a little bit better. I suppose it's a net fishery, but I'll chance it. 12-ounce line as well. Shouldn't really do that. I should have put the net underneath that one. I mean, that's a lovely fish for bread. Beautiful. I keep referring to my father and what he taught me. But, you might find it strange. A chap of my age keep talking about his dad, but he was a legend, still is a legend. Yeah. In fact, I remember him winning the County Palatine Championship. 1,800 anglers fished it, and he fished it on exactly this method with bread. And I think it was 67 when he actually won it on the Peak Forest Canal. Won it with a weight just under 3 pounds of these very, very tiny fish. And the following year, the same competition, equally as many anglers again, well, about 1,500 if my memory strikes me right. And the following year he was second. Like I say, he was quite a legend in the northwest. And the thing about this bread fishing, the important thing about it, it is the foundation to all fishing, because once you understand the importance of putting that little bit of ground bait exactly on that spot and presenting the baited hook in the right method, choice of float, whether it be waggle or whether it be top and bottom, to suit the conditions, once you understand how to catch fish on these mini waterways, then as he said, you can go anywhere in the world and catch fish, because the understanding of accurate feeding and accurate presentation is what fishing is all about. And I suppose when he taught me my fishing on the local canal, I suppose he reckoned that that was the best base learning platform that anybody could have. And how right he's been. Well, bites seem to be drying up on this line now. I'm struggling now. I just had 4 or 5 casts without a bite. I think it's getting time to change. I think the fish have probably gone farther across the canal again. We've chased them from here to towards the middle, towards the boat run, and now I'm going to go farther across. And that's just what it's about, a progression of following those fish across the canal. There's a bite, though. Oh, dear me. We're really scraping the barrel now. I mean, when you start, after catching a multitude of little roach and the gudgeon is starting to come, in fact, that's it. I'm going to change line now and go farther across the canal. And for that, it's going to need a completely different rig. I could just about get away with going with a slightly heavier top and bottom float, but to make it easier, I'm going to go with a little waggler rig. A longer pole and a little waggler rig, the sort of rig I would use on the line I've just been fishing if it had been windy conditions. There's the rig all ready for me. As you can see, a much, much longer pole. And let's have a look at the float. The line's fastened to the end of the pole just the same. But the actual float itself, it's a little waggler, which means, once again, that the line is sunk under the water, because the surface of the water is represented by my fingers there, so the line is under the water. So if it was a windy day, then we've got that line buried and there's no interference. A very fine top, ever so important in canal fishing, and especially on this bread method, shows the faintest of bites very, very clearly. You see the majority of the shot is around the base of the float. See a little tiny swivel, but that swivel and that attachment allows that float to collapse on the strike, so there's no interference. A little back shot, and if you want on windy conditions, you can even put a second back shot farther up the line. The actual shotting pattern, ever so simple. Shirt button again, but in this time, instead of using styles, just to prove that you can use shot, then I have done. The same hook, the same bloodworm hook, number 10 shot, about 9 inches from the hook, a little bit bigger space to a number 8, equal space to another number 8, and equal space to another number 8. So it's 3 number 8s and a number 10 down the line in about 4.5 foot of water. Dead simple. And on this method, I'm going to actually change the hook bait from those little pressed cubes. I'm going to actually try the paste. I've got a ball of white paste and a smaller ball of yellow paste. In fact, if I put them in that tin foil, I can use my same little container without getting those cubes stuck all over them. Now simply, to bait up with this, all you do is just nick just a tiny amount of paste off the ball and then roll that into a smaller ball like that. Little ball of ground bait right into the swim, and then just cover that with the float. And you see with this very, very sensitive float, you see every shot register as that bait falls progressively to the bottom. And there's the fish. And another little trick when you're paste fishing, just like the ivy leaf, what the old timers used to do is when they caught their first fish, they used to handle it quite roughly, I suppose, because what they were doing, they were taking a little bit of the fishy smell into their hands, and then they'd pick up the paste and roll the paste in their now fishy hands. And they reckon that was their way of getting or eliminating any human smell that may be transferred from your hands onto that bread paste. It's amazing sometimes the size of the hook you can actually get away with. To prove a point, I once put a tiniest pinhead of paste onto a 16s hook and caught fish just the same. That doesn't mean to say that I'm fishing with a 16s hook. I'm still with a 20s, and I'd only be too keen to go to a 22s if things got hard. The difference with this presentation, with this bottom end float, as opposed to the top and bottom float, is unbelievable. This fish is far, far superior. It's beating that surface skim. In fact, it doesn't exist anymore. But whenever I can fish top and bottom, when the conditions will allow me, then I find it far better, especially for hitting bites. Much cleaner, and especially when there's a good strong flow on the water that you're fishing, then you do seem to have that better presentation. You can actually hold that line right off the water, hold the line right to the tip of the float when it's fastened top and bottom. It just shows you how they dried up on that second line, and now we've gone on to this third line, and farther across the canal the sport's hotting up again with virtually a fish every put in. And the thing is to remember that no matter how fast the float goes under, it's just like that. Just lift, and in they come. It's just a simple lift like that. And in fact, the fish are coming nice and steady now, small though they may be. And like I say, just a change from the white paste to the yellow paste can sometimes make the difference between that little bit of better quality fish. You can't carry on catching that quality of fish. It just needs to be the odd one, the odd bigger fish in there amongst that shoal. And by switching to the yellow paste, It's amazing just how often it does work. Whether it'll work this time or not, I don't know. There's a touch on the yellow paste, but well, not a monster, but it is. You've got to admit, just a shade bigger. Just a little bit bigger. If we had a net full of those, then it wouldn't be too bad. I'll try the yellow paste again, but it's not often that it works 2 out of 2. It's just you've got to build a swim up. You know there's a lot of fish there. That's the time to stick it on. But nevertheless, I'll try it again. Lost my rhythm there, see, I'm getting excited catching bigger ones. Always feed before you cast. I just fed it just short of the flock and still just pull the float back. Well, I had another bite on the yellow paste. Who knows, maybe they're preferring the yellow paste to the white paste today. Maybe that big one was just a fluke. But for instant results, I find the white paste to be the better. It's amazing how accurate you can get with this ground bait just by continually putting a small ball in with every cast. It doesn't need many practice sessions before your accuracy actually comes. Just pull that float back into that cloud. But it's not just a method for canals, this. In fact, any small waters, little lakes and even farmers' ponds. In fact, another place I used to go besides the canal practicing this was, in actual fact, a little tiny pond, about 18 inches, 2 foot deep, absolutely full of crucians. And once again, that being exact with the depth and fishing just off the bottom, where other people never saw the bites or were missing bites, then it's very, very fine tattle, shotted so delicately, plumbed so exactly, that it didn't have used to sort those crucians out as well. There, that's 2 casts on the trot with the yellow paste, or 3 casts. First cast we got that little bit better stamped fish, and then no bites. Well, I think the day's getting to an end, and I think that perhaps the next fish should be the last one. And there it is. Oh dear me, oh dear me. What a way to end a programme. The biggest fish of the day. How about that? But nevertheless, I think we've proved the point that this bread really does score. Even though a lot of the fish have been small, not as small as that one, but a lot of them have been small, but we must have, I don't know, well over 100 fish there. There won't be a terrific weight, perhaps, I don't know, 2 or 3 pounds, maybe 4 pounds if we're lucky. But we have proved every method. So let's get these fish back into the water so they can live for another day. Just take the bank stick off first. And what I always do to return these fish, don't empty them the full length of the net. You know, it's only a short net anyway, this. And that's a point which I haven't mentioned. On the canals, short nets are better than long ones. I see people with long nets and they put the bank stick in at this end and they peg the other end of the net on the bank at the other end. Just a little scallop of net in the canal. And that's wrong, because those fish have got nowhere to swim. And the reason why people do that, they don't want the net being towed around from one side to the other as the canal changes direction. They're better off with a shorter net that's more, and staked down in front of you, that's more stable. It won't frighten the fish at close range. As you saw, we caught them nice and steady. But when you do come to return your fish, it's best to turn the net inside out. Now, there's perhaps a few more than what I thought, but turn the net inside out so you're not actually emptying the fish the full length of the net. Let's just have a look at these. There you are. A nice little catch of mainly roach. There's a little hybrid, little roach bream hybrid, and perhaps the biggest roach of the day. Oh, what is it, 4 or 5 ounce? The rest are all little fish, but I don't know. There's got to be perhaps about 4.5 pounds, but enough to prove the method. Get them all back. Nice and quickly. Well, I've enjoyed the day. We've had plenty of fish, small albeit, but I've seen times when those sort of fish are golden, and there's been many a match won with a lot less than that. It's like my father said, learn this method on these small canals and you can go and fish anywhere in the world successfully. In the next 5 programmes we'll be fishing some real cracking venues where we'll expect bigger and better catches, and yet the same principles will apply. And basically it's all about preparation. That means the preparation of bait, whether it be bread or whether it be turning your own casters or breeding gozzers. That's the preparation. The presentation is all about plumbing the depth, learning the topography, where the shelves are, and fishing to those shelves and fishing at the exact depth. Everything you've seen here today applies, like I say, to fishing generally. Anyway, till next time, tight lines.